Hi, today I want to introduce Nancy Mohrbacher. Nancy is a board-certified lactation consultant from Chicago, United States. She is a trainer, speaker, and author of many books for parents and professionals, such as Working on Breastfeeding Made Simple. She is also a co-author of one of the most useful books for parents, Breastfeeding Made Simple: 7 Natural Laws for Breastfeeding Mothers. In 2008, Nancy's contribution into the field was awarded by the designation Fellow of the International Lactation Consultant Association. Nancy has a great app called Breastfeeding Solutions and also a YouTube channel, Nancy Mohrbacher. In this series of videos, we're going to talk with Nancy about birth and breastfeeding, how to make breastfeeding simple from the very beginning, and also how to handle a busy working schedule and breastfeeding in a less stressful way. If you find this video useful, please like it, subscribe to our channel, consider becoming our patron on patreon.com/MAPA and please welcome Nancy.
My name is Nancy Mohrbacher. I'm a lactation consultant from the Chicago area in the United States. I started working with breastfeeding families back in 1982 as a volunteer breastfeeding supporter. I became board certified in 1991. I had a very large private practice here in the Chicago area where I went from house to house teaching families the tricks for how to make breastfeeding work. And since then, I've done many other things. I've also written a number of books for both parents and professionals. So I'm very well versed in the research. That's one of my areas of interest. So I'm very happy to be with you today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nancy. So let's start with the very beginning, which is giving birth. From your experience, how do you think, and if yes, how does the birth experience connect to the further breastfeeding? And if there is any connection?
Yeah, well, there can be a connection. If, for example, if a birth is traumatic or very stressful or very long, it could certainly leave a new mother, feeling, as if she's not ready to breastfeed right away, which, is definitely a drawback. Also, it can delay the increase in milk production, by as much as a day if the birth is very stressful and traumatic. So it can affect breastfeeding in those ways, but that doesn't mean it necessarily, it makes it impossible to breastfeed. It just makes the early days more challenging.
Mm-hmm. And specifically in Cyprus, but also in many European countries, the C-section rate is quite high. Does this have any correlation to the willingness of the family and mother to breastfeed?
Well, of course, after a surgical delivery, families are going to be concerned about the baby's weight resting on the incision, on just generally, moving around being more painful. So I would say, after cesarean birth, they're very common in the US as well. These families do need some extra support and help. In the United States, one of the things we've been working on is trying to make sure that the baby is put in skin-to-skin contact right after delivery. And that has become much more common even after cesarean delivery. So having that initial skin-to-skin contact, and early nursing can make a big difference. The research shows there does seem to be a difference in babies' weight loss pattern when they've been born by cesarean, but we're not really sure if it's due to physical causes or just because they're not nursing as early and as long and as often. So that still remains to be seen.
I've heard somewhere the information that once the labor have been induced, there is an extra fluid actually in the body of the mother, and it can have, and when the baby loses weight, it actually the baby doesn't actually lose his weight. It actually, the extra fluid goes out. Is it correct? Or
and it's the main reason of giving formula right away after the birth, because the baby lost more than 10% of its weight.
Yeah, well, it doesn't have to be due to an induction. Sometimes mothers are given a lot of extra IV fluids during labor, even when they're not induced. And yes, it is true when, especially if the excess fluid is given within 2 hours of delivery, what the research has told us is that it elevates the baby's birth weight due to the extra fluids. The extra fluids actually go into the baby's body. So it raises the birth weight. And then during the first 24 hours, these fluids are urinated out by the baby. And that it makes it look like the baby's lost a lot of extra weight when really all they're losing is the excess fluids that they got at the end of labor. So what some researchers are suggesting, and we do have some studies on this now, is actually using the baby's 24-hour weight as the reference weight when gauging weight loss rather than the birth weight itself. Because, you know, it's interesting, you know, feedings can be going very, very well, and yet it may appear that there's something wrong because of this initial weight loss. So yeah, it's very important to understand that and to take that into consideration.
And again, from your experience of working with couples and observing a lot of women in postpartum period, what are the common challenges that preparing mother should at least be aware of?
Well, I think that some of the common challenges, I would say, if I had to come up with one thing that makes breastfeeding most challenging, it's the fact that most of us maybe grew up watching babies be bottle fed rather than breastfed. And so there's a lot of things we sort of unconsciously try to translate, you know, into breastfeeding that don't translate very well. For example, when I learned to breastfeed my 3 sons, I was taught to hold my babies in a bottle feeding position while I was nursing. Because back in those days, you know, that's really all that we knew. So for example, the way that we position babies initially can make a huge difference in how easily or difficult early nursing is. And that's why, you know, one of the things that I've done is I've created some videos showing newborns using some of the positions that research has found, you know, is most likely to lead to easier early breastfeeding. You know, I call these the starter positions or natural breastfeeding positions. And I have a website, it's naturalbreastfeeding.com, where there's a free video that demonstrates this and explains the positions and how they make early breastfeeding easier. So that's one thing. Another area is that families often believe that breastfeeding is supposed to be painful. And even healthcare providers sometimes think that that's true. And so they don't make the adjustments that they could be making to make breastfeeding comfortable. So these early positions I just mentioned, we just got some new research last fall that found that when women use these starter positions in the beginning, they have half of the incidence of breast and nipple problems as compared with those who use the positions that we used to teach sitting upright. So it's, you know, those are 2 things I think that are really important to know a little bit about before a baby's born.
Are there any other expectations that you quite often meet in, you know, young couples, parents, regarding breastfeeding, which are not really helpful?
Yes, definitely. We often talk about, for example, early nursing, that babies should nurse at least 8 times a day. We say, you know, on average, newborns nurse 8 to 12 times a day. So what happens is that new parents often do the math in their heads and they think, okay, well, that means that my baby should be nursing every 2 to 3 hours. And even healthcare providers sometimes believe this. And this is not normally how newborns nurse. And so there's a lot of misconceptions about how newborns should be nursing and what it means. So for example, what is more common is that newborns do what we call cluster nurse. And that means they bunch their feedings together at certain times of the day. So for example, in the evenings and overnight, especially in the beginning, newborns are much more awake, alert, and ready to feed. And during the day, they tend to be more sleepy. And so parents, you know, they often find themselves struggling with this because they're thinking, oh, I need to wake my baby up during the day. Oh, there's something wrong. My baby wants to nurse every 15 minutes at night. And so they have the assumption that this means they're not producing enough milk, which is not the case, because these are actually very normal nursing patterns.
Yes, and this is the case why lots of parents are asking maybe they should introduce formula to the baby.
Right.
And lots of health providers are confirming this misconception.
Right, because for many healthcare providers, I know here in the United States, you know, I can't speak for Cyprus, but in the United States, most healthcare providers haven't really received any training in breastfeeding. It's a very strange thing, but it's accurate. And so unless they happen to have breastfed their own children, or they have a spouse who breastfed, then they may not really know very much about it. And so they may be gauging, what is normal for newborns based on formula feeding norms, which are often very different. So yeah, that happens here as well.
I would like to ask you your experience and your mother's clients' experiences about what to avoid, what to expect, what not to have, and how to prepare yourself to defend yourself in the hospital if you feel that you are given the wrong advice by the health providers whom you tend to trust.
Yeah. Let me ask you, do you have lactation consultants in your hospitals?
Sometimes in several hospitals, not everywhere.
Yeah. Well, if you go to a hospital that has a lactation consultant, that would be the person you'd probably ask for and, discuss these things with. But I think in general, it's a really good idea to learn as much as you can about breastfeeding before you go to the hospital. I was lucky enough, I was going to peer support meetings for the last 4 months of my pregnancy with my first child. And so I felt like, that was really wonderful. I don't know if you have peer support meetings there on Cyprus, but it is a great way to learn about it, because not only do you get to hear the information, but you hear it in the context of people's actual lives and all the emotion that's there. And so it makes the information just so much easier to remember. And so I felt like I was pretty well prepared. Another thing you can do is, figure out before the baby comes, who is going to be your support network for nursing. So, even if there's not a lactation consultant there, maybe there's another lactation consultant who's available to you after discharge, and it's somebody that you could call if you hear advice that maybe doesn't sound like it's correct advice. The other thing I think that's very important is if you are given incorrect advice in the hospital, when you get home, to write them a letter and say, I was very disappointed in the advice that I was given, and explain why, because that's really what helps to create change in hospitals. One of the things I've been doing in recent years is I've been hired by hospitals. They've contracted me to help them improve their breastfeeding practices. So, I don't know if they have competition going on there in Cyprus, but sometimes hospitals want to be known as a hospital who's really, good with breastfeeding. So writing a letter can be helpful.
Yes, thank you. Maybe you can give advice to all women, to all breastfeeding women and those who plan to breastfeed, how to make the breastfeeding easy. Everybody wants it easy. And everybody's asking for tricks and know-how.
Yeah, well, there's
bullet, magic bullet.
There's not a lot about newborns in general that's easy, no matter how they're fed. I would say that newborns are probably the most high maintenance individuals on the planet. So, I mean, you kind of have to sort that out. But I think one of the things that makes it easy is understanding what babies are born with that makes breastfeeding go more smoothly. So, for example, I mentioned these starter positions when we first began talking. Some of you might know that when babies are born, if the baby is placed on the mother's body right after birth, the baby will actually make their own way to the nipple and latch on and start to feed. That's called the breast crawl. And that is actually the ideal start to nursing. Normally, when someone gives birth, they're sort of leaning back and then they put the baby on in skin-to-skin contact. That is the absolute best way to begin, because what the research has found is that babies who are allowed to do the breast crawl and latch on themselves at that first feed, they have fewer breastfeeding problems during the hospital stay. The parents have less pain. The milk comes in sooner. All kinds of good things happen if the baby's allowed to go onto the breast on their own. And then if you continue to use these positions, like in the hospital, it's great because the hospital beds usually will recline. And so you're leaning back and you put the baby on top and let the baby, do the latching. That actually makes the process so much easier. I find that when parents are sitting up straight and they're leaning over, they're hunching over, they're trying to latch the baby, like they're the problem with the newborn is if you're sitting up straight is that gravity pulls the baby down and away, and the newborn cannot do anything to help themselves on. The parent has to do everything. Of course, the parent may not be experienced with breastfeeding, so they don't know how to get the baby on deeply so it doesn't hurt them. And so there's a lot of instruction that's involved. There's a lot of, problems that come from that. Whereas if they just lean back, and put the baby on and let the baby do the latching, the baby knows what to do. So I think knowing what the baby brings to the table and how to make use of that, I think is really, really important. So, for example, the parent can use their arm to support the baby's head. The baby's head just kind of is resting on it. Again, I have a free video, which I think is great for parents to watch during pregnancy. It's at naturalbreastfeeding.com. It's right on the home page. We've got one in English, then below there's one in Spanish, in case anyone there speaks Spanish. But it actually demonstrates this with a number of different nursing mothers of different ethnicities and different body types. So you can kind of see how it works. And it explains what the adjustments are for using these positions. And one of the things I really like about it is, of course, everybody's really tired after delivery. It allows parents to rest.
Is there anything else, Nancy, you want to say, share, or you haven't said? Or
well, I would just say to any new parents that it's very important to be with other nursing parents, whether it's online or whether it's in person, because that's how you set your mind at ease. There's a lot of anxiety around new parenthood, and I'm still actively involved in peer support. And one of the reasons that I am is because I feel so strongly that new parents really need each other, and they need to know the reality of life with a baby, of every age. And so the more you can actually connect with other new parents, especially nursing parents, if you're nursing, I think the more pleasant your life is going to be, and the easier your adjustment to parenthood.